This year marks the 242nd anniversary of the Battle of Cowpens. Every year, for its anniversary, an event is held at the Cowpens National Battlefield. This event has a firing demonstration, a guided walking tour, a cavalry demonstration, speakers, 18th century music, children activities, and at night they have a wonderful lantern tour that takes you back in time. So sit back and relax while I tell you everything I know about cowpens. In the earliest days when settlers first came to the upcountry of South Carolina, it was easily determined by the thriving deer and buffalo population that grazing animals would be a good investment. During this time, the land was not valued by acreage alone, but rather by its fertility. Fertile land would have a plant named the grazing cane. This cane could grow up to 30 feet high. How much cane and its height determined the land and its value. Prior to the Revolutionary War, settlers free-ranged their grazing animals and fences were not used. Because of this, a person called a stock driver was hired to watch over and protect the herd from four-legged and two-legged predators. In early times, this was not a reputable occupation because it was extremely dangerous. The person would have to live in the wilderness with the animals and on the fringe of society. However, that changed as the stock drivers became wealthy and became landowners. Eventually, many families would send their eldest son into this occupation in hopes that he would earn a fortune and gain experience in the ways of the world. However, the profession remained dangerous as young stock drivers were occasionally killed by rustlers or by criminals after they received the money for their herd. This hard, self-reliant work resulted in superior woodsmen and soldiers. When the herd was ready for export, the stock drivers would round up the herd in a large area of land void of many trees called cow pens. After rounding up the herd, the stock driver would then escort them down the Nomad Road to Philadelphia or Charleston. In the upstate, the largest and longest used cow pens was called Hannah's or Saunders. This would be where the famous battle that turned the tides of the Revolutionary War to Patriot victory. On January 15th, Daniel Morgan was kept advised of Tarleton's approach. After that day, he and his men camped at Burr's Mill, where he wrote to Nathanael Greene, saying, "The British Bulldog and Tarleton are baying at my heels. The broad river ahead is rampaging at its banks." The next day, Morgan and his men marched to a familiar place called the Cowpens so that they could gather their thoughts. Morgan knew a winter storm was coming, and so was the enemy. Morgan wondered if they should stay and fight or try to flee to the mountains. While trying to decide, a message arrived. Tarleton found your last campsite while the ashes were still warm. By midnight, Morgan made his decision to stay and fight when General Andrew Pickens and his men arrived. Morgan believed that the feared Tarleton was probably a mere 3 hours away. For the rest of that night, Morgan lay under his canvas, listening to the rain pounding and pondering the situation. He knew from his scouts that the Royal Artillery was with Tarleton, armed with 2 small yet easily movable grasshopper cannons, whereas they had none. Morgan was also troubled because he knew Tarleton's men were well trained and equipped with hardened veterans of war, whereas he and his men were hungry, barely clothed. He also knew that his men had little military training and that the men preferred a hit-and-run method of warfare. But what his men lacked, they made up for in being excellent riflemen. And so this conflict, matching the rough-hewn frontiersmen, Daniel Morgan, and the disdainful, educated, and proud aristocrat Tarleton was set. As Morgan had expected, the British bugle sounded revelry at 2 a.m. on the 17th. By 3 a.m., Tarleton's men had eaten and were on the move. However, the darkness and rain made Tarleton's march to Cowpens 5 hours. Morgan explained to his men because of the flooded river they would stay and fight, but that there would be no retreat. It is documented that before the British arrived, Daniel Morgan went behind a fallen tree and devoutly prayed. In the bitter cold, Morgan arranged his men, who clapped and stomped their feet to stay warm. He placed his sharpshooters in front, and then behind them the militia. On the high ground he placed the Continentals. Behind this hill Morgan arranged Washington and McCall's cavalry units. Morgan knew the militiamen would be the first to waver in the battle, and he asked them to fire at least 2 shots before they fell back. When Tarleton arrived, he and a few greencoats rode ahead to see the Americans' positions. Upon seeing rifles aimed towards them, they turned around to get the entire force. When Morgan heard the shouts arise from the British as they advanced the field, Morgan galloped among his men, bellowing, "They gave us the British halloo, boys. Give 'em the Indian halloo, by God!" Then he cheered on his men to victory by reminding them of their wives, children, and homes. During the assault, when the British halted to reload, the British got to see Morgan's sharpshooters' deadly accuracy. At this, half of the British officers hit the ground dead. The British dragoons then swept down the field towards the militia, who fled behind the Continental lines. It is said that when the Continental lines opened fire, it came in one great volley and was a beautiful sight. Then the American cavalry appeared with swords raised. One of these cavalrymen, named Major Young, recounted, "We made a furious charge, cutting through the British cavalry. In this charge I exchanged my tacky for the finest horse I've ever rode. It was the quickest swap I've made in my life." As the 50-minute battle drew to an end, Tarleton set forth his kilted Highlanders. Then he and the rest of the dragoons tried to flank the American line. Howard was a leader of the Virginia and Maryland troops in the American line. He ordered the Virginians to make a right angle and then a wheel turn left to face the Highlanders. However, during the confusion of battle, they did an about-face and marched to the rear. When the rest of the American line saw this, they thought it was retreat, so they also began to march to the rear. It was at this time that Morgan galloped across the front line, telling them to stop and prepare to do a wheel and fire. However, all the British noticed were the men turning around, and so they thought that they were retreating as well. Feeling victory was in their grasp, they surged forward until they were a mere 30 yards away. Then the Patriots turned and shot a deadly fire. At this critical moment, the militia and the American cavalry smashed into Tarleton's forces. The surprise and fury of the Americans so shook the Kingsmen, some threw down their guns and begged for mercy. Washington, noticing Tarleton in flight away from the battlefield, dashed after him, outriding all other men. Suddenly, the two were side by side. During this climactic moment, Washington hit Tarleton with his saber, breaking it in two. The hit so wounded Tarleton that it left a permanent scar on his hand. It didn't take long, and 2 of Tarleton's aides were quickly approaching and entrapped Washington between them. The first aide was disarmed by Sergeant Major Perry, and the second, who was about to kill Washington, was struck down by Washington's bugle boy, who was a mere 14 years old. As Tarleton left the field, he turned around one last time to fire a shot. The bullet hit Washington in the knee and his horse's shoulder. While this wound would not be fatal, it would handicap Washington, making this his last battle. Washington later asked his bugle boy what he wanted for saving his life. The boy requested Washington's silver boot buckle. He became the only soldier in history to wear a silver buckle as a military decoration. The Battle of Cowpens is of importance because it was a victory that utilized a large portion of militia, and it was the first link in a chain that would eventually end at Yorktown. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, and as always, thanks for watching.